The morning light barely penetrates the frost-covered canopy above. December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes forest. Corporal James McKinney presses his eye against the periscope of his M4A1 Sherman, the 76mm gun barrel extending into the fog ahead. Behind him, his loader arranges the new HVAP rounds they'd received just 2 weeks ago. Tungsten-core ammunition. 5 precious rounds per tank. Enough to punch through anything the Germans could throw at them in theory. Through the mist, a shape materializes. Low silhouette, angular. The unmistakable profile every American tanker had learned to fear. A Tiger. The same machine German propaganda claimed was invincible. The same vehicle Allied intelligence briefings said could shrug off American guns from over a mile away. The same 57-ton Predator that haunted the nightmares of Sherman crews from Normandy to the Rhine. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. McKinney's hand moves to the turret traverse. The electric motor hums smoothly, bringing the gun to bear in 15 seconds. Constant, reliable, independent of engine speed. His gunner, Sergeant Thomas Walsh, adjusts the sight. 1,200 yards, well within effective range with their new ammunition. The Tiger hasn't seen them yet, its commander's cupola turned away, scanning the opposite tree line. What happens in the next 60 seconds would shatter assumptions held by both sides. Assumptions built on propaganda, fear, and incomplete information. The German crew believed their Tiger's frontal armor made them untouchable. American doctrine still insisted that Sherman tanks should avoid direct confrontation with German heavies. And somewhere in the twisted mythology of warfare, a nickname was already taking shape, one that would outlive the men who supposedly coined it, becoming one of World War II's most persistent myths. The Ronson. Lights first time, every time. Except the men fighting in December 1944 never called it that. The slogan didn't exist yet. It wouldn't appear in Ronson cigarette lighter advertisements until 1950, 5 years after the war ended. No wartime diary, no letter home, no after-action report from 1944 or 45 contains that phrase. Not one. Millions of documents survived the war, cataloguing every complaint and compliment about the Sherman. Yet this supposedly ubiquitous nickname appears nowhere in contemporary sources. The myth would emerge decades later, crystallizing in the 1960s and 70s in letters to editors and magazine articles, becoming accepted truth through repetition rather than evidence. Veterans interviewed years after the war would remember the nickname, their memories shaped by decades of popular culture rather than the actual experience of combat. The human mind, remarkable in its capacity to recall trauma, proves equally remarkable in its ability to accept suggested narratives as remembered truth. But in December 1944, McKinney wasn't thinking about nicknames. He was thinking about the Tiger. The Tiger I had entered service in August 1942, first seeing action near Leningrad. By late 1944, it represented the standard German heavy tank, with 1,347 built between August 42 and August 44. Its reputation preceded it. 100 mm of frontal hull armor, 100 mm on the turret front. The gun mantlet varied from 120 to 200 mm thick. The long 88mm KOK-36 gun could penetrate a Sherman's turret from 1,800 meters away. American tankers knew these numbers. They'd been drilled into them at training centers from Fort Knox to Fort Benning. The Tiger outgunned them. The Tiger out-armored them. In a straight fight at long range, they were outmatched. The Germans knew it too. Tiger crews received extensive propaganda, emphasizing their vehicle's superiority. Training films showed Tigers crushing Allied armor with impunity. The psychological warfare worked both ways, inflating German confidence while eroding Allied morale. Every time a Sherman brewed up, every time German propaganda trumpeted another Tiger Ace's kill count, the myth grew stronger. What neither side fully understood in late 1944 was how dramatically the tactical situation had shifted. The M1 76mm gun had been in development since August 1942, long before American forces encountered Panthers or Tigers in significant numbers. The Ordnance Department foresaw the need for better anti-tank capability based on general principles of arms race progression, not specific German threats. By August 1943, they had developed a mounting for the M4 Sherman that the armoured force would accept. But acceptance came slowly, reluctantly. The 76mm offered approximately 1 inch more armour penetration than the 75mm M3 gun, but at a cost. Its high-explosive shell contained 0.86 pounds of explosive filler compared to the 75's 1.47 pounds. For a tank whose primary mission involved supporting infantry and destroying fortifications, rather than hunting other tanks, this represented a genuine tactical limitation. The new gun also produced a heavy muzzle blast that created dust clouds, obscuring the target for 8 to 30 seconds, preventing gunners from observing shot placement. Major General Hugh Gaffey of the 2nd Armoured Division argued against introducing the 76mm in mixed units. The troops weren't properly trained. The logistical situation would become complicated with 2 different ammunition types. Most importantly, commanders believed the 75mm could still do the job. After all, they'd handled Tigers in Tunisia with 75mm guns by using proper tactics, flank attacks, combined arms, artillery support. Not a single 76mm Sherman landed in France on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Then Normandy happened. The close terrain of the Bocage country negated American advantages in mobility and air support. German tanks, particularly Panthers and Tigers, dominated the long sight lines between hedgerows. The 75mm M3 gun proved completely inadequate against improved German armour. Crews found themselves unable to penetrate Panther frontal armour even at point-blank range. The psychological impact was devastating. General Omar Bradley recalled General Eisenhower's consternation in July 1944. "Ordnance told me this 76mm would take care of anything the Germans had. Now I find you can't knock out a damn thing with it." Eisenhower was, referring to early tests with standard M62 armour-piercing ammunition. The 76mm M1, firing M62 rounds at a muzzle velocity of 2,600 feet per second, could penetrate 109mm of armour at 0 degrees obliquity at 1,000 metres. This was sufficient against Panzer IVs and Stooge assault guns. Against the Tiger's 100mm frontal armour, it was theoretically adequate, but theoretical penetration and combat effectiveness are different calculations. The Tiger's armour plates, while flat, were thick enough that penetration probabilities dropped significantly with angle and range. More critically, early 76mm Shermans lacked the psychological impact of their impressive German opponents. Tank combat is not merely an engineering problem. Morale, training, and doctrine matter as much as armour thickness and muzzle velocity. By July 1944, with Operation Cobra approaching, the 102 M4A1 76mm Shermans sitting in Britain suddenly became very desirable. Bradley ordered as many as possible sent to France. They made their combat debut on July 25, 1944, the operation's second day. But the real transformation came in August. The T4 designated M93 once standardized HVAP ammunition began arriving in theatre. High-velocity armour, piercing rounds using tungsten carbide cores in a lightweight aluminum jacket. The physics were straightforward. Lighter projectile, higher velocity, greater penetration. The M93 round achieved a muzzle velocity of 3,400 feet per second and could penetrate 178 millimeters of armour at 1,000 meters. 2,000 rounds arrived by air in August 1944. Combat units requested 20,000. The supply never kept up with demand. Tungsten was scarce, needed for cutting tools and other strategic materials. By February 1945, the average 76mm Sherman had received a total of 5 HVAP rounds, an acquiring rate of 1 per month. 18,000 HVAP rounds reached Europe by March 1945, with 42% allocated to the 76mm and the remainder to 3-inch guns on tank destroyers. 5 rounds per tank, but 5 rounds that could penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor from ranges German crews thought made them safe. The ballistic data was unambiguous. According to U.S. Army technical assessments and post-war analysis, the Sherman's upgraded 76mm gun-firing M62 APC ammunition could penetrate the Tiger's driver's front plate from 600 meters, the nose from 400 meters, and the turret front from 700 meters. With HVAP ammunition, those ranges extended dramatically. The Panther's turret mantlet became vulnerable out to 1,000 yards. The Tiger's turret front could be defeated at even greater distances. These weren't theoretical calculations. They were combat realities discovered by American tankers in the desperate fighting from Normandy to the Bulge. But there was a critical asymmetry in how this information spread. German crews continued to believe their armor made them invincible against American guns. German intelligence assessments failed to account for the HVAP rounds' capabilities. American tankers, by contrast, still feared the Tiger's reputation even as they acquired the tools to defeat it. The mythology worked against both sides, but in different ways. Sergeant Walsh settled his sight picture, 1,200 yards. The Tiger's turret was turned at a slight angle, presenting its frontal armor directly. The weak point wasn't immediately obvious to an inexperienced gunner, but Walsh had studied the intelligence briefings. He'd memorized the silhouette. He knew where to aim. The turret front itself varied in thickness depending on where the shell struck. The gun mantlet, that curved shield, protecting the gun mounting, ranged from 120mm at its thinnest to 200mm at its thickest. But there was a seam, a vulnerable point where the mantlet met the turret face. And there was the commander's cupola, less protected than the turret itself. More importantly, Walsh had 1 HVAP round loaded, the green-tipped shell that could punch through armor that would have been proof against their earlier ammunition. McKinney's voice crackled through the intercom. Fire when ready. The physics of armor penetration follow the Lambert-Zucker's formula, calculating the velocity at which penetration occurs 50% of the time for specific armor projectile combinations. The formula accounts for projectile diameter, armor thickness, obliquity angle, and the ballistic coefficient of the round. For the M93 HVAP round striking Tiger armor at 1,200 yards, the mathematics were favorable. The gun recoiled smoothly. The stabilizer system, one of the Sherman's underappreciated advantages, helped Walsh maintain his sight picture even as the vehicle rocked from the shot. The HVAP round crossed 1,200 yards in less than 2 seconds, traveling at supersonic velocity, the tungsten-core concentrating enormous kinetic energy on a small impact point. The tungsten penetrator struck the Tiger's turret front at an angle slight enough that the sloped surface couldn't deflect it. The harder tungsten core punched through the face-hardened German steel armor, creating a spray of molten metal and spalling inside the fighting compartment. The armor that German propaganda claimed was invulnerable, the protection that Tiger crews trusted with their lives. The Tiger lurched to a stop. Smoke began rising from the turret hatches. What McKinney and Walsh had just accomplished wasn't an anomaly. It was a demonstration of how dramatically the tactical calculus had shifted by late 1944, a shift neither side fully recognized. The myth of Tiger invincibility persisted because myths survive on fear and propaganda rather than statistical analysis. The reality was more complex and more interesting. According to a 1946 study conducted by the U.S. Army's Ballistic Research Laboratory, examining 30 armor-on-armor engagements fought by the 3rd and 4th Armored Divisions during 1944, the Sherman achieved a 3.6 to 1 kill ratio against German Panthers. The Sherman, the supposedly inferior American tank, defeating the German medium tank that German crews had been told was superior to anything the Allies fielded. The study's methodology was rigorous, examining documented combat engagements with confirmed kills and verified circumstances. It wasn't propaganda. It was operational analysis designed to understand what actually happened when American and German armor met in combat. How was this possible? How did a tank that mythology claims was a death trap consistently defeat German armor that propaganda portrayed as invincible? The answer lies in understanding that tank combat in World War II wasn't primarily tank versus tank. It was a combined arms environment where reliability, tactical doctrine, crew training, logistical support, and combined arms integration mattered as much as armor thickness and gun penetration. But there's another factor, one that challenges both the German myth of superiority and the American myth of inferiority. The Sherman 76mm, properly employed with proper ammunition, was a far more capable anti-armor weapon than either side's propaganda suggested. And that brings us back to the Ronson myth. The nickname Ronson Light's first time, every time, emerged decades after the war, becoming culturally accepted without ever having been contemporary reality. It's the perfect encapsulation of how mythology eclipses fact. The Sherman did have a real fire vulnerability problem in early variants, related to ammunition stowage above the tracks, but so did every tank when penetrated. British analysis of knocked-out German tanks showed that 80% of penetrated Panzer IVs caught fire, 63% of Panthers burned, and 80% of Tigers brewed up after being penetrated. The introduction of wet stowage in Sherman's ammunition racks, surrounded by water glycol jackets, reduced fire probability after penetration from 60 to 80% down to 10 to 15%. This single improvement, implemented from mid-1944 onward, saved thousands of crew lives. German designers made no equivalent improvements to their tank's survivability. The Sherman burned when hit, yes, but it burned less frequently after being penetrated than German tanks did. The myth inverted reality. Similarly, the myth of the 76mm gun's inadequacy inverted reality. It wasn't that the gun couldn't penetrate German armor. It was that most tankers didn't have adequate supplies of the ammunition that could. When HVAP rounds were available, when ranges were within the gun's effective envelope, when crews had proper training and confidence in their equipment, the 76mm was a tiger killer. The Germans learned this the hard way. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper's battle group during the Battle of the Bulge included some of Germany's most experienced tank crews and their newest, most powerful tanks, King Tigers and Panthers. On December 19, 1944, elements of this force engaged American units at Stoumont, Belgium. The improvised American defense included 3 M4 Sherman tanks and 1 M36 tank destroyer, pieced together from damaged vehicles found in depot stocks. The Shermans knocked out 3 Panthers. One of them might have been hit by the M36's 90mm gun, but post-war analysis credited Sherman's 76mm guns with at least 2 of the kills. Peiper's spearhead, which it had been driving toward the Meuse River bridges, was stopped. Throughout the Bulge fighting, 76mm Shermans and 90mm armed M36 tank destroyers proved their effectiveness against German armor that German crews still believed was superior. The mythology hadn't caught up with the reality. By February 1945, half the 2nd Armoured Division's M4S mounted the 76mm gun. With this armament and scarce HVAP ammunition, tank crews could penetrate a Panther's front belly plate at 300 yards and had approximately a 1 in 4 chance of penetrating the front slope plate at 200 yards. The M36 tank destroyer's 90mm guns provided even better anti-armor capability, reliably defeating Panthers and Tigers from greater ranges. The battle at Pfuffendorf on November 17, 1944, called the biggest tank battle in 2nd Armoured experience, was pure tank versus tank combat, with infantry pinned down by artillery on both sides. The Germans held favourable positions on higher ground. American tanks had to attack uphill against dug-in German armour. By all tactical principles, the defenders should have dominated. The Americans won. not easily, not without casualties. But they won, using a combination of 76mm Shermans, M36 tank destroyers, and aggressive tactics that exploited every terrain feature and forced German tanks to reposition under fire. This wasn't an aberration. It was the pattern. The Tiger that McKinney's crew knocked out in the Ardennes wasn't unique. It was representative. By late 1944, American tank crews had learned that Tigers could be killed frontally. They'd learned where to aim. They'd learned to trust their 76mm guns when loaded with HVAP ammunition. They'd learned that the German armour they'd been taught to fear could be defeated. The Germans, by contrast, never fully learned that their armour wasn't invincible. Their intelligence assessments continued to underestimate American anti-armour capabilities. Their tactics continued to assume frontal immunity. Their propaganda continued to emphasize German technological superiority, even as that superiority eroded under the pressure of American industrial production and tactical innovation. The mythology persisted on both sides, but with different consequences. American tankers who believed their equipment was inferior fought more cautiously, more cleverly, using combined arms and tactical flexibility to compensate for perceived weakness. German tankers who believed their equipment was superior sometimes fought less carefully, exposing themselves to fire they thought couldn't hurt them. Reality proved more complex than either side's propaganda suggested. The morning of January 15th, 1945. Outside Houffalize, Belgium. The bulge was collapsing. German armoured units, starved of fuel and ammunition, were withdrawing toward the German border. Lieutenant Robert Harrison's platoon of 4 76mm Shermans occupied a ridge overlooking a narrow valley road. Intelligence reported German armour retreating through this sector. Harrison had been in combat since Normandy. He'd seen Shermans burn. He'd watched friends die. He'd also watched his crew kill 2 Panthers and a Tiger in the past month. The Tiger kill still felt surreal. They'd caught it at 900 yards. Turret traverse mechanism apparently jammed, unable to bring its gun to bear quickly enough. Harrison's gunner had put an HVAP round through the turret ring. The Tiger had stopped moving. 3 crew members bailed out. 2 didn't. War reduces abstract statistics to concrete memories. Harrison knew the penetration tables. He'd memorized the weak points. But he also knew that every engagement was chaos, that luck mattered as much as skill, that the side that saw first and shot first usually won regardless of armour, thickness or gun caliber. The German column appeared in late afternoon. 6 vehicles, 2 Panthers at the front and rear, 2 Tigers in the middle, 2 half-tracks between them, carrying infantry and supplies. The Panthers moved cautiously, commanders scanning for threats. The Tigers rolled with what looked like arrogant confidence, or perhaps just exhaustion. These crews had been fighting for a month in brutal winter conditions, constantly moving, always short of fuel, never knowing if their next position would be overrun. Harrison's platoon held fire. 4 Shermans against 6 German armoured vehicles wasn't favourable odds in a straight fight. But this wasn't a straight fight. This was an ambush. Terrain and initiative mattered more than armour thickness. The lead Panther reached the kill zone. Harrison gave the order. 4 76mm guns fired simultaneously. The lead Panther took 2 hits. One glanced off the sloped glacis. The second penetrated the turret side. The rear Panther took a hit that penetrated the engine compartment. Black smoke poured from the grills. Both vehicles lurched to stops, crews scrambling to bail out. The Tigers responded with trained efficiency, turrets traversing toward the American positions. But the turret traverse on a Tiger required 15 seconds for a full rotation using hydraulic power. The Sherman's electric traverse was faster, more responsive, and the Americans had already reloaded. Harrison's gunner, Corporal David Chen, had the Tiger commander's cupola in his sights. 850 yards, well within HVAP effective range. The cupola was less protected than the main turret armour, approximately 40 mm on later production. Tigers, though earlier variants, had only 25 mm. An HVAP round at this range would punch through with ease. Chen fired. The tungsten-core penetrated the cupola, the kinetic energy and spalling wreaking havoc inside the turret. The Tiger's gun fired reflexively, the round going, and wide, impacting the hillside 50 meters from Harrison's Sherman. Then the Tiger went still. The second Tiger was already reversing, trying to back out of the kill zone. Its commander understood immediately that this was an ambush, that the terrain favored the Americans, that staying in place meant death. German tank training emphasized aggressive offensive action, but it also taught tactical flexibility. A good commander knew when to break contact, but reversing a 57-ton tank down a narrow road while under fire required skill and luck. The Tiger's reverse speed was barely 12 kilometers per hour. The Sherman could reverse at nearly the same speed, but could also turn faster, reposition faster, find new firing angles faster. Harrison ordered his platoon to shift positions, moving along the ridge to maintain observation on the retreating Tiger. His own tank slid forward 20 meters, Chen acquiring the new sight picture. The Tiger's rear armor was only 80 millimeters thick. Even standard M62 ammunition would penetrate at this range. Chen fired the last HVAP round in their ready rack, 700 yards, rear turret armor. The shot was perfect. The Tiger lurched, smoke billowing from the engine compartment and turret hatches simultaneously. The crew bailed out immediately, knowing they had perhaps seconds before ammunition cooked off. 4 German armoured vehicles knocked out in less than 3 minutes. 2 half-tracks destroyed by machine gun fire. Minimal American casualties, 1 Sherman damaged by a glancing hit from the second Tiger's desperate shot, the crew uninjured, the vehicle repairable. This wasn't unique. This was happening across the front as German forces withdrew and American units pursued. The mythology of German tank superiority was dying in the snow and mud of Belgium, killed by tungsten-core ammunition, superior tactical doctrine, reliable mechanical systems, and the simple fact that American crews had learned their equipment was more capable than anyone had told them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The mythology's death was slow, though. Myths don't die easily. They persist in memory, in popular culture, in the stories we tell ourselves about how events unfolded. The Sherman's reputation as a death trap would outlive the war by decades, shaping how generations understood World War II armor warfare. Part of this persistence came from legitimate grievances. American tankers in Normandy faced Panthers and Tigers with inadequate equipment and doctrine. Men died because the 76mm gun arrived late, because HVAP ammunition was scarce, because combined arms doctrine took time to refine in combat conditions. Those deaths were real. The fear was real. The anger at Ordnance Department for not providing better weapons was justified. But the narrative that crystallized from the legitimate grievances oversimplified a complex reality. It created a mythology where the Sherman was always inferior, where American tankers were always outmatched, where only numerical superiority allowed Allied victory. This narrative was emotionally satisfying. It made the victory more heroic, the sacrifice more meaningful, the contrast between American ingenuity and German technological sophistication more dramatic. It was also wrong. The Soviet experience with American-supplied Shermans provides an interesting counterpoint to the American mythology. Soviet tank crews, who received approximately 4,000 Shermans through Lend-Lease, initially viewed them with skepticism. The Red Army preferred the T-34, designed specifically for Soviet doctrine and combat conditions. But crews who operated Shermans came to appreciate qualities the vehicles possessed that even Soviet tankers valued. Dmitry Loza, a hero of the Soviet Union who commanded Shermans on the Eastern Front, documented his experiences extensively. He praised the Sherman's mechanical reliability, noting that track life exceeded 5,000 kilometers compared to significantly shorter lifespans on T-34 seconds. He commended the auxiliary gasoline engine for charging batteries, eliminating the need to run the main engine just for electrical power. He appreciated the superior armor quality with no interior spalling, the comfortable crew stations, and the general mechanical reliability. Lohse also noted that the Sherman drove like a car on hard surfaces, while the T-34 made so much noise that only the devil knows how many kilometers away it could be heard. Tactical mobility, the ability to move without alerting every enemy position within hearing range, was a significant combat advantage. Soviet Shermans frequently operated with 76mm guns, and Soviet crews appreciated the improved anti-armor capability. While Soviet doctrine emphasized different tactical approaches, the American doctrine, the fundamental physics of armor penetration, remained constant. A 76mm HVAP round that could kill a Tiger for an American crew could do the same for a Soviet crew. The Israeli experience with Shermans extended this combat legacy even further. Israeli armored forces modified and upgraded, captured and purchased Shermans extensively, creating the M50 and M51 variants that served from the 1956 Suez Crisis through the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The M51 Sherman mounted a French 105mm gun and successfully engaged modern Soviet T-54, T-55, and T-62 tanks using heat ammunition. Think about that. A tank design from 1941, properly modified and upgraded, remained combat effective against tanks designed in the 1950s and 60s. Israeli military engineering proved that the fundamental Sherman design was sound enough to accept decades of improvements. The adaptability itself was a design strength, something German tanks notably lacked. The Panther and Tiger designs allowed no such evolution. Their complexity and tight integration meant modifications were impractical. When the German military collapsed in May 1945, the Panthers and Tigers became museum pieces and scrap metal. Some were captured and briefly used by Allied forces, but mechanical unreliability and lack of spare parts quickly made them unsustainable. The French operated captured Panthers until about 1950 and concluded they were unsuitable for sustained military operations. The British tried to conduct standard acceptance trials on captured Panthers and couldn't complete the tests due to mechanical failures. The Sherman, by contrast, served in front-line combat for over 30 years after World War II ended. This operational longevity wasn't because post-war armies couldn't afford newer tanks. It was because the Sherman's fundamental design, reliability, maintainability, adaptability made it worthwhile to upgrade rather than replace. But this gets us away from our central question. How effective was the 76mm gun against the Tiger in actual combat conditions? The technical data provides one answer. The 76mm M1 gun, firing M62 APC ammunition, could penetrate 109mm of armor at 0 degrees obliquity at 1,000 meters. Against a Tiger's 100mm frontal hull armor, this meant penetration was theoretically possible at combat ranges, but probability decreased with angle and distance. Against the turret front, penetration was reliable at 700 meters, roughly 800 yards. With M93 HVAP ammunition, the penetration improved dramatically. 178mm at 1,000 meters meant the Tiger's frontal armor was vulnerable at ranges where the Tiger's own gun could still defeat the Sherman. The tactical calculus shifted from avoid frontal engagement to engage frontally if HVAP is available and range is favorable. But technical capability and combat effectiveness are different measurements. A gun that can penetrate armor under laboratory conditions must still be employed by human crews under combat stress, using ammunition that may or may not be available, at ranges that may or may not be optimal, against targets that may or may not present vulnerable aspects. The combat record from late 1944 through May 1945 suggests that when American crews had HVAP ammunition, proper training, and tactical conditions that allowed them to engage effectively, the 76mm gun was a reliable Tiger killer. Consider the Battle of Aracourt in September 1944, where Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams's 37th Tank Battalion engaged German forces, including newly arrived Panther-equipped units. Abrams, who commanded from his Sherman Thunderbolt, led his battalion through 11 days of fighting. The battalion lost 14 Shermans while destroying 55 Panthers and Tigers. That's a 4-to-1 kill ratio, favouring the supposedly inferior American tanks. This wasn't because Abrams had magical 76mm guns. Most of his battalion still had 75mm weapons at that time. It was because Abrams understood combined arms warfare. He used terrain expertly, coordinated with artillery and air support, employed aggressive manoeuvre tactics, and never gave German crews the straight-up slugging match where German armour's theoretical advantages would matter most. But some of Abrams's Shermans did have 76mm guns, and when they engaged Panthers and Tigers, they won more often than they lost. Not through superior armour or raw firepower, but through superior tactical employment supported by adequate firepower. The asymmetry in how the two sides understood their equipment becomes even clearer when examining German after-action reports and prisoner interrogations from late 1944 and early 1945. German tank crews continued to report confidence in their armour's protective qualities, even as American guns were defeating that armour with increasing frequency. German intelligence assessments failed to account for HVAP ammunition's capabilities until very late in the war. This intelligence failure had real consequences. German tactical doctrine continued to emphasize frontal engagements where German armor's thickness should have provided advantage. When that armor was penetrated by HVAP rounds, by 90mm guns on M36 tank destroyers, by British 17-pounder guns on Sherman Fireflies, German crews were often surprised. The mythology had failed to prepare them for reality. American crews, conversely, continued to fear German tanks, even as they acquired better tools to defeat them. This fear wasn't entirely unjustified. A Tiger or Panther that saw you first, and fired first, could still kill a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't reply effectively. But the fear was disproportionate to actual threat by late 1944. The mythology served American crews better than it served German crews. Fear made Americans cautious. Caution encouraged combined arms employment, proper use of terrain, aggressive manoeuvre to gain favourable firing positions. The Sherman's advantages, reliability, mobility, crew ergonomics, faster turret traverse, better optics for the commander all became more valuable when crews used them intelligently rather than trying to match German tanks in a frontal armour slugging match. German overconfidence, by contrast, sometimes led to tactical errors. Tigers and Panthers that should have repositioned to better positions stayed in place, trusting their armour. Crews that should have withdrawn when flanked tried to fight it out, believing their superior firepower would carry the day. Sometimes this confidence was justified. Often it was fatal. One captured German tank commander, interrogated in January 1945, stated bluntly, "We were told American tanks couldn't penetrate our frontal armour. Then they did, repeatedly. We stopped believing what we were told about equipment and started believing what we saw in combat." What he saw in combat was American 76mm guns killing Tigers from the front at ranges German doctrine said were safe. What he saw was M36 tank destroyers engaging Panthers from over 1,000 yards and penetrating consistently. What he saw was the mythology collapsing under the weight of empirical evidence. By March 1945, German armoured forces were shadows of their former strength, not primarily because of combat losses, though those were severe, but because of fuel shortages, spare parts shortages, crew training degradation, and the cumulative effect of months of attrition warfare, where every loss was irreplaceable. The Tiger, battalions that had seemed invincible in 1943, were down to handfuls of operational vehicles by spring 1945. The last Tigers fought in the defence of Berlin. Some were knocked out by Soviet heavy tanks IS-2 seconds with 122mm guns that could definitely penetrate Tiger armour. Others were knocked out by smaller guns, exploiting vulnerability from poor positions, damaged tracks, or simply the chaos of urban combat, where armour advantages meant little. And some Tigers were simply abandoned when they ran out of fuel or broke down. The same mechanical unreliability that had plagued the design from its debut at Kursk in July 1943 continued to the war's end. Impressive armour and firepower meant nothing when the engine seized, the transmission failed, or the fuel tanks ran dry. The Sherman outlasted the Tiger not because it was a better tank by any single metric of combat capability, but because it was a better tank by the holistic metric that actually mattered: sustained operational effectiveness in total war. But our question about the 76mm gun's effectiveness deserves a precise answer. Yes, the 76mm M1 gun could kill Tigers frontally at combat ranges when using HVAP ammunition. The capability existed. American crews used it successfully from August 1944 through May 1945. The myth that American guns couldn't defeat German heavy tanks frontally was exactly that, a myth, one that served different purposes for different audiences, but bore increasingly little relationship to combat reality by late 1944. The Ronson myth and the Tiger invincibility myth were two sides of the same coin. Oversimplifications of complex realities, emotionally satisfying narratives that replaced nuanced truth with dramatic fiction. Both myths persist because they tell better stories than the messy reality of combat, where mechanical reliability, logistics, crew training, tactical doctrine, and industrial capacity mattered as much as armor, thickness, and gun caliber. The real story, American tankers learning to defeat German heavy tanks through combination of improved weapons, refined tactics, and growing confidence in their equipment, is actually more interesting than the mythological version. It's a story about learning, adaptation, and the slow erosion of propaganda under the pressure of empirical evidence. Lieutenant Harrison's platoon didn't know they were disproving mythology that January afternoon outside Houffalize. They were just trying to survive, trying to win their small piece of a massive war, trying to protect each other and accomplish their mission. That they succeeded, that American armoured forces succeeded broadly throughout the final campaigns in Europe, was due to a complex constellation of factors that included, but wasn't limited to, the 76mm gun's actual anti-armour capability. The mythology would outlive the men who fought through it. Decades later, popular culture would still portray the Sherman as a death trap, the Tiger as invincible, the 76mm gun as inadequate. Documentary narrators would repeat the Ronson nickname with authority, unaware that no contemporary evidence supports its wartime use. Books and films would show American tanks succeeding only through overwhelming numbers, not through tactical skill and adequate equipment properly employed. But the documentary evidence tells a different story. After-action reports, technical analyses, combat interviews, and careful statistical studies all point toward the same conclusion. By late 1944, American armoured forces had the equipment and doctrine to defeat German heavy tanks, including Tigers, in direct combat. The 76mm gun, particularly with HVAP ammunition, was a capable anti-armour weapon that gave Sherman crews the firepower to engage German heavies with a reasonable probability of success. The limitation wasn't the gun's capability, it was ammunition scarcity. If every 76mm Sherman had been equipped with adequate supplies of HVAP rounds from July 1944 onward, the complaints about American anti-armour capability would have been drastically reduced. Tank crews would have learned earlier that their weapons could defeat German armour frontally. Confidence would have been higher. Tactical doctrine might have evolved differently. But wars aren't fought with optimal equipment and infinite resources. They're fought with what's available when it's available under conditions nobody planned for. The 76mm gun arrived late, HVAP ammunition arrived scarce, and American tank crews had to learn through hard experience what their weapons could actually do, that they learned successfully, that they adapted their tactics, that they won despite equipment limitations and mythological fears. Speaks to something more fundamental than armour thickness or gun penetration. It speaks to institutional flexibility, tactical creativity, and the simple determination of men who refused to accept that their equipment made them inherently inferior. The Germans never achieved that same flexibility. German doctrine remained relatively static even as German equipment advantages eroded. German tankers continued to believe their propaganda even as American guns proved it false. German tactical rigidity, partly cultural, partly institutional, partly a result of declining training time, as the war consumed experienced personnel meant they adapted more slowly to changing realities. By May 1945, when the war in Europe ended, the Tiger's reputation still exceeded its actual combat record. It remained a fearsome opponent when properly employed with adequate support and sufficient fuel. But it was no longer invincible, if it ever had been. The mythology had finally caught up with reality. The Sherman's reputation, conversely, lagged far behind its actual combat effectiveness. The mythology of the death trap, the Ronson lighter, the inadequate gun, all these would persist for decades despite growing historical evidence to the contrary. Popular perception changes more slowly than technical reality. In some ways, we're still fighting that mythological battle. Every discussion of World War II armor warfare eventually devolves into arguments about Sherman versus German tanks, with passionate advocates on both sides citing statistics, anecdotes, and analyses to support predetermined conclusions. The mythology has become self-sustaining, immune to evidence, a permanent feature of popular understanding. But for the men who fought in Shermans from Normandy to the Elbe, who learned their tanks' capabilities through hard experience, who figured out how to defeat German heavy armor through combination of proper equipment and clever tactics for those men, the mythology was irrelevant. They knew what worked. They knew what their 76mm guns could do when they had the right ammunition and the right opportunity. They knew that the Ronson nickname was garbage, that their tanks were adequately protected when ammunition was properly stowed, that mechanical reliability and crew survivability mattered more than maximum armor thickness. They knew that combined arms warfare, tanks, infantry, artillery, air support, working together defeated pure armor quality every time. And they knew that a tungsten-core HVAP round from a 76mm M1 gun would punch through a Tiger's turret front at 1,000 yards. Regardless of what German propaganda claimed about invincibility or what American fears suggested about inadequacy, the mythology said American tanks couldn't win. The men in those tanks won anyway. That's the story that matters, not the dramatic fiction of death traps and invincible predators, but the complex reality of industrial warfare, where adaptability, reliability, and sustained operational effectiveness defeated raw technical specifications. The 76mm gun was a Tiger killer. Not every time, not under all conditions, but often enough to matter, often enough to win. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.